Tell us about this initiative. You are a keynote speaker at this event. What are you looking to achieve?
Well, in terms of first of all, give you a little background on the conference. So this is the seventh year of this annual investment conference. It has become the investment conference globally on an annual basis. 6,000 delegates, 500 speakers. And unlike many other conferences, including the original Davos from the World Economic Forum, this conference is truly global. There are delegates and speakers from every corner of the globe, plenty from Africa, lots from Asia and Latin America, and a tremendous focus on the global south and on the BRICS nations, and a true commitment to inclusiveness, a commitment to the notion that it's not just about, when it comes to what happens to investment money, when it comes externally into, for example, a continent like Africa, it's not just about what the investors want. For it to work in a way that it often hasn't in the past, it needs to be, that money needs to be, there needs to be a consensus as to what happens to that money, what happens to those profits. And that means the stakeholders domestically on the ground have to be part of the process from the beginning. So it's a pragmatic, realistic approach that recognizes that you can't plan the world, you can't plan an economy successfully. History tells us that's a complete failure. And it's a matter of encouraging and fostering creativity and entrepreneurship and innovation and technology. Tremendous focus here on technology, cryptocurrency, AI. How can we harness these things to help with green energy and the blue economy, etc. For someone such as myself, I think this is a valuable conference. So I'm writing about it, talking about it with fine people such as yourself and others around the world, trying to explain what I'm discovering here and also explain what the conference is about and why I think it's a valuable use of people's time, both to participate directly and also to pay attention to it and take interest in it.
Saudi Arabia is talking about vision, 2030. Is there a link between hosting this kind of conference in Saudi Arabia and the link with the vision 2030?
Saudi Arabian-backed conference, because the notion was quite straightforward, to encourage investment in Saudi Arabia, which the Saudis have been very successful at. It branched out, broadened out over a couple of years into being a more truly regional, sort of pan-Arab, pan-Middle Eastern conference. And now, as I say, it's global. However, naturally, it has, you might say the hub of it is Saudi Arabian, and the Saudis have all kinds of plans and ideas, creative ideas underway to diversify their economy, to move away from their dependence on oil, as do the Qataris and the Emirates, etc. And so what's the evolution of this conference, broadening its themes and broadening the participation geographically and by sector, is part and parcel of that. So is the 2030 agenda, and it's all, I think, I'm not speaking for the Saudis, obviously, but in my sense from the outside, this all dovetails each one of these events, each one of these programs, each one of these objectives and goals. It's part and parcel of what is a quite nuanced and sophisticated transition that the Saudis are attempting to undergo, obviously principally economically, but not exclusively socially, culturally, politically as well. And of course, whether we're looking at this conference, whether we're looking at the 2030 agenda or other specific items one could mention and discuss here, clearly these are imperfect instruments, whether it's for the Saudis themselves or more broadly and more regionally or globally in terms of what they may be able to achieve, what their positive externalities may be, what those positive ripples on the pond may be. They're imperfect, but they are an improvement on what came before, both, I think, in terms of what the Saudis were doing regarding their domestic economy, what lessons they were able to offer externally around the region, even globally. And so just, you put all this together, you put it sort of all in the blend of the synthesis of it is that the Saudis have, I think, taken a very continuing to take a series of very proactive, positive steps, down a path that's inevitably bumpy with all kinds of challenges and hurdles, but they're making progress. And others in the region, I think, have taken that example and are running with it themselves. As I say, the Qataris and the Emirates would be good examples of that, good illustrations of that. and then there are broader applications, perhaps regionally and globally. So much to pay attention to, and very much a case of watch this space when it comes to what the Saudis are doing economically, environmentally, and in terms of their application of technology.
It's well put. You said the Saudis are very proactive, and no wonder it's called Davos in the desert, right? But let's talk about the theme for this year, right? New compass. Now, it brings to mind varying images, but what it tells me is that it is futuristic, right? So talk to me about youth participation in this year's event.
Yes, I mean, there is a tremendous focus on the future, whether sort of on paper, as you suggest, in terms of the program itself and technology and AI, very much interest in there's interest in new frontier economies, but interest in the new frontiers. To use the term as it used to be used, more in terms of space exploration and its application in space of technology, all of that. But in practice, as well as on paper, there is a clear youth emphasis here. It's my first time participating, so I can't claim to know what demographically it looked like previously. But just as I was saying, it looks and feels global, truly global in terms of overall representation. It also looks and feels more youthful, younger than comparable conferences that I've attended, either regionally or on a global scale. There's no question that there are a lot of people here, true participants, delegates, and speakers who are in their 20s and 30s. And I think part of that, one, is an effort to ensure that this truly is inclusive in all the demographic, by all the demographic metrics. But there's so much emphasis on technology. There's such representation from Silicon Valley, but also high-tech hubs other high-tech hubs around the world, that naturally, if you're going to talk AI, you're going to talk cryptocurrency, et cetera, in that tech space, then you're going to be talking to not just, you might say, the nerds in that industry who tend to be more youthful than some of us, but you're going to talk to the CEOs, the inventors, the founders, and of course, they generally are very young themselves. So it's fascinating to see that you have more young people than would normally be the case. You have far more women than is often the case at a business or come tech event, particularly when you consider where it's being hosted and where the natural catchment area is. So it's fascinating, and I think again, no silver bullets here, but encouraging, highly encouraging, both for the organizers and what they're achieving each year with this conference, but also demonstrating to others who want to do similar work that there is an audience, or in business commercial terms, there is a market for a more inclusive approach.
Looking at the crisis between Israel and Hamas, how much of impact has this had on the conference, and how is the level of participation like?
Well, the short answer is that it appears to have had no appreciable impact. I know that the organizers, drew a large breath when Hamas attacked Israel, because their timing appeared to be very unfortunate. They didn't know if what would happen to the conference, and many people on the outside expected that so many of the influential and important stakeholders would not want to be in the Middle East. And although there are individual cases where professional demands, whether it be media, business, law, politics, have meant that individuals have to be elsewhere at this time, whether that's in the Middle East or beyond, because of the new circumstance, overall, it has had no impact whatsoever. So just about everyone who was going to be here has come anyway. And in fact, I understand that they kept increasing the participation in new delegates in recent the last couple of weeks since the tragic events began to unfold in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. So the conference has gone ahead as scheduled, on plan. They've hit their mark with pretty much everybody who was important to the planning from the beginning, which is fantastic. Now, of course, that's not to say that the issue hasn't been present here. And although there isn't a panel on it, because that's not it's obviously a political, military, national security question. It isn't the focus of the conference. Naturally, it's front of mind for all the delegates and speakers and organizers, as it is for anyone. You go anywhere in the world, any kind of public or even private forum, and this is what people are thinking about and talking about when they have the opportunity. So it's coming up in the press conferences. Some of the leading figures, like the president of the World Bank, or yesterday on Tuesday when the president of Kenya spoke, he was asked about how he thought that the ongoing troubles would affect his plans to attract foreign investment to fight climate change in Africa. So everyone's being asked and thinking about what the repercussions will be. And of course, no one has a good answer because there is no answer yet. No one knows how long this will go on. No one knows how much worse it will get before, please God, it ends up getting better. And so there's a great deal, I think, there's a great deal of anxiety. There's a certain amount of curiosity. There's pessimism in some quarters, more cautious optimism elsewhere. I think that if this conference or a subsequent event were held, in the next few months, then you're going to have a little more opportunity to catch one's breath and have a better appreciation of where things truly will end up. And therefore, I think perhaps that then the questions will be more central, more formally addressed, perhaps in this type of a venue. But it's not a cloud hanging over the conference per se, but it's a cloud hovering over the world, isn't it? Hovering over all of us. And so therefore it cannot be completely ignored.
I would like you to talk to us about the disruption taking place in the global market, with the new frontier and some of the development taking place at the conference, looking at the submissions of some of the keynote speakers about the disruptions taking place in the global market with the emergence of Africa as the new frontier.
Sure. Just to clarify, you said disruption, not destruction, right? That's right. I just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. My apologies.
If any exists between the new frontier and the emerging markets.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, disruption is central to, you might say, the mission of this conference, and there's not just a recognition and appreciation, but an advocacy about something that I think is very important. That these are interwoven concepts. The notion that disruption is a good thing, is necessary. Not that there aren't downsides, but in macro terms, it's necessary. That tolerance for risk needs to increase in macro terms. Not that there aren't downsides, and the things that are risky often don't, pan out, right? So many of the speakers and many of the interactive sessions, because there are plenary sessions, there are panel sessions, but there are also, for example, these innovation hubs, and there are opportunities for those with new technology, for example, to pitch that new technology to venture capitalists who are in a position to sort of make those things a reality with the right infusion of capital. So trying to sort of synthesize and summarize all of those dynamics here, I would say that there's tremendous focus on educating both the people here but more importantly beyond these walls, around the world, that through disruptive technology, for example, creativity can be unleashed, entrepreneurialness can be unleashed to a degree it hasn't been previously, especially in developed countries, right? So we have a situation in Africa. I'm especially familiar with the Kenyan context, but it applies, I think, in many African countries where you have these very resource-rich environments. That's not a news flash, but it needs to be emphasized. And it's something the Kenyan president emphasized yesterday. If you're looking at green energy, then Africa is the place you want to start, right? So you have resource-rich environments, and crucially, you have in recent times sort of a more educated workforce, more highly skilled workforce, more technologically savvy populations. And you put all that together and you have an opportunity for disruption to have positive outcomes, for the externalities to be largely positive. But the question is, how does that happen? And so central to some of what has been said and discussed is how do you marry that need for capital with the capital where it exists, which isn't exclusively in the West and in Asia, but obviously it is skewed that way, and it requires a couple of things. And one of those is, I think, what the conference is the message trying to get out, which is that it has to be a more inclusive process and a more consensual process than it's been in the past, and in a sense, a more democratic process. That is, it's not as simple as a government giving foreign aid to a government that will then do with it as it sees fit. And we know from history, not necessarily the best outcomes for the domestic population, or it could be a government or private actor in the West, for example, funding extraction of resources in country X or Y in Africa or another at least a less developed country elsewhere in the world. And the outcomes may be beneficial for one single actor, public or private, in that less developed country. But again, the general population doesn't benefit. And so the notion is that if from the get-go, from the genesis of these potential projects, that the stakeholders domestically in the developing countries are sort of at the table, then that's a recipe. It doesn't guarantee, what's the product that's cooked or baked at the end of the day is to everyone's satisfaction. But the chances are that it's going to be tastier and healthier than in the past, right? So this is important, and it's also why it's so important that this conference has a truly global face to it, right? As I've been touching on in terms of the demographics. I mean, the global South is not sitting on a secondary stage for an hour so that the organizers can tick that box and virtue signal and say, look, we had those people here. We didn't listen to them, but we did have them here. They did get their 5 minutes in the sun. The global South is this conference to a large, it is central to this. The BRICS nations are this conference, right? This conference is not about the West; it's about everybody. Everybody has a voice here, so I think that's really, really important. And so I don't want to sort of overrate the pudding and suggest that because of these approaches, then less developed countries are guaranteed to do better, because it's a two-way street. They have to do a better job, and even better than some of them have done here, actually, that I've observed firsthand, a better job of pitching their claims to be suitable, worthy, positive recipients of external investment. Because you can, it's the old story of business, right? You can have the best product in the world, you can have the best environment for business to grow, but if nobody knows about it, if you don't sell it, if you don't tell your story well, then it means that you're not going to get anywhere. The product's not going to get off the ground, or your economy is not going to receive that investment. And African countries have every reason to argue with great justification that they should be receiving so much more foreign direct investment than they are, whether it's for climate change mitigation or more generally, more broadly. But to this point, I don't think most of them have done anything like as good a job as they needed to do or they could do. And when I observed with the Kenyan president yesterday, sort of making his pitch for foreign funds, I just don't think that there's the strategic or tactical skill set there, or the communication skills to sort of get the job done. I hope I'm wrong. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I very much hope, like him and his government, to be successful in this regard. But it's a two-way street. There's more room at the table now for the emerging markets and the new frontier economies. But that means that they have to also step up to the plate, and they have to make that time at the table really count in a way that they haven't done previously.
Looking at emerging markets, they seem to offer more stability and liquidity compared to frontier markets. But why, in spite this fact, why are international investors taking interest in frontier markets, especially the new frontier markets?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a multi-part answer, I think. I mean, the emerging markets aren't taking perhaps quite the hit that the developed economies are, but they're not perhaps as attractive, all of them, as they were because of geopolitical issues and macroeconomic variables and factors and dynamics that have, not in all cases, but in some cases, like say for example, China, have put something of a lid on their growth. So the emerging markets are still attractive, some more than others, but they are not perhaps sort of the it girl of global investment. They're not. Their time as the trendy investment isn't quite as hot as it was, and of course, investors are always looking for the next best thing, as somewhere else to put their money. And with the movement out of America in terms of investment, and even out, I would argue, out of the Western financial system, period, more and more investors are looking for, if not safer shelters, then looking for places where they're not going to be subject perhaps to the sanctions that have been applied more recently by the West or in the West. And so you get to new frontier economies, and they are traditionally, high risk, high reward investments, and that remains the same. But I think what's happened is that the distance, the gap between the high risk of a new frontier economy and the moderately high risk of an emerging market is not as great as it was, just as the risk level between the emerging markets and developed economies is not as great as it was. Sadly, none of this is because of good news. It's all because at the top, in terms of a hierarchy of economies, the developed aren't doing as well, the emerging aren't doing as well. But the good news for the new frontier economies in Asia and Africa and elsewhere is I think they're getting a new look by some investors, they're getting a closer look by some, and they're getting a second and third look by others who in the past thought it was just a little too risky. You've got, and so it's a double-edged sword. Also, a double-edged sword. There's sort of two sides of the ledger that investors, the ones I'm talking to, are weighing up when it comes to these new frontier economies. The obvious downsides are these economies tend to be less politically stable. The political systems overseeing these economies, regulating these economies, tend to be less stable. There tends to be either a history or a prevalence of a more corruption on the political side, which bleeds into business and commercial life, lack perhaps of transparency, a legal system where the property rights and the oversight of business isn't either well defined or isn't adequately and equitably applied. All of these things are naturally concerns for investors anywhere, but they tend to really raise their sort of ugly head when it comes to the new frontier economies. Of course, on the flip side, what's attractive is that these are comparatively, in the old days, one would have said unexploited economies, but for various reasons, good and bad, that's sort of not a vogue way. That's no longer in vogue to put it like that. These are sort of untapped and unfulfilled economies in terms of their potential as exporters and as sources of economic development. So they tend to be very commodity rich, therefore very export oriented. If there is development, it's usually about manufacturing, and those are subject, again, on the flip side of the ledger, those are subject naturally very much to the fluctuations in the currency market and in the commodities markets. So it's a lot of risk to take on, but the potential for larger profits than elsewhere, the potential to get in early and really make a killing, probably a bad choice of word in current climate, but it is significant. So it's an individual investor's decision. You can see why some are going head, jumping in with both feet, and others are saying, look, my head tells me, my heart wants to do it, my head tells me it's still too risky. But that's where we are, I think, to put it bluntly, with the new frontier economies. But the good news, as I say, is that there's bad news elsewhere. So at least there's an opportunity for them to make their pitch. The question is, how well do they make that pitch?
This event, the Future Investment Initiative, is a yearly one, right? And this is the 7th edition. Like we said, the theme is the New Compass. But last year, the theme was Invest in Humanity, right? With fears surrounding the launch of artificial intelligence, taking over the roles of humans and all of that, would you say that the goal that this initiative set for last year has been achieved so far?
Well, I mean, number one, I shouldn't speak for the organizers, but if I can pretend to do so, I would suggest. I think if they were here, they would say that any of these goals are long-term goals, right? And you're not going to see appreciable improvement, or let's say the goal is poorly applied, you're not going to see the negative consequences right away. So I think it would be fair, it would be unfair to judge whether or not they have there's progress has been made on that or any other achieving that goal. But I think it's important to really recognize that it's not for the organizers to achieve anything really, and that's really the point of this. Whereas to contrast it, as I have in writing today, with the World Economic Forum in Davos, which is very much about a comparatively small group of people who have decided they have figured it all out and they know what's best for everyone economically and environmentally and else in other ways, and they have the media's ear, and so through the media they tell the world what should happen in great detail. They plan it all out. Here it's very different. It's about exchanging ideas, promoting ideas, and then seeing what happens, because it's up to the individual investors, the individual governments, the individual innovators, the individual countries to run with the ideas that they think are good and see what happens. So, for example, investing in humanity, I mean, obviously, it's very broad and one can look at that in different ways. But in the sort of contemporary context, clearly not in all quarters, but in some quarters, particularly in sort of more policy making quarters, there's this new focus upon, you might say, the sort of the optics and making sure or hoping to ensure that the policy outcomes are more quote unquote people oriented. They have more of a social and cultural a recognition of the social and cultural consequences of policy, as well as obviously the environmental ones as well. So socially, culturally, environmentally sustainable economic policy making, which in the abstract sounds fine, but I think we know that the World Economic Forum Davos in the Alps mistake that's applied by so many governments now is to decide upon a strict way of enforcing that prescription, or to attempt to achieve those goals. And as with just about any plan, private or public, it's going to go wrong in some way, form or fashion. It's not going to achieve its goals, probably not even come close. The alternative, which I think is what is meant here at this conference, is for all these respective stakeholders to apply those principles and those values as they see fit, right? So that they are wholeheartedly enthusiastic about what they're doing. And it's sort of you might say a global experiment in microcosm, because there are these micro experiments would be happening in terms of investing in humanity in all its facets around the world. And then you're going to see which ones actually bear fruit, which ones were well-intentioned, but ran up against whatever obstacles, or perhaps they were inherently flawed to begin with. And you then hope that there's a cross-pollination that takes place, and people learn from stakeholders, learn from other stakeholders locally or regionally or globally, and apply those lessons. And it's the same principle that used to apply to economic policy generally. You want a competitive environment, and you let everyone do their thing, and some will succeed and some will fail, but those who fail and those who come after those who fail will hopefully take note of why and how those who succeeded did so. And in macro terms, there are micro failures along with micro successes, but in macro terms, everybody in general, let's say in the global environment, benefits, because there are net number of successes, net benefits. And I think that's how the notion of investing in humanity, for example, or environmental sustainability needs to be approached, right? There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no silver bullet. we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, even if we're broadening our horizons and the scope of our policy making and the scope of the goals that we're setting for our policy making.
All right, talking about new frontier markets, I would like you to talk to us about some of the countries that are taking the front seat when it comes to the new frontier markets, the characteristics, what are peculiar to them, the market trends, and what make them forces to reckon with.
Right. Well, I mean, it's again, a lot of this comes down to definitions, right? Do you, for example, do you put countries like Nigeria, do you classify countries like Nigeria and Kenya as emerging markets or as new frontier economies? I myself, I think I'm more comfortable viewing them as emerging markets because I think that they've developed to an extent where they're not quote unquote fully developed. They're not first world economies, but they've made so much progress that in terms of skilled workforce and capital inflows and that sort of thing, those metrics, that they're not really new frontier economies anymore, although they share some characteristics. Because with the new frontier economies, in addition to the commodities focus, there is the lack of a skilled workforce and the lack of capital, access to capital, really are the central characteristics. And that certainly was the case for some of these more economically influential African countries like Nigeria and Kenya, but I don't think is accurately the way to characterize them now. But so I think, I mean, there are some African countries who fit the category, but I think countries in some of the Southeast Asian countries more clearly do, Vietnam, Cambodia, for example. And whether it's Asia, whether it's Africa, you're talking about those who have something to sell, but they don't have the means to get their product, their natural resource either into product form, to put it very crudely and simply, and or they don't have the means to get that product then to market, right? It might even be a problem, can be a problem domestically, but certainly a problem internationally. And so for those countries, it is an enormous challenge because you first of all have to get the world's attention, and we discussed that a little this morning, how that is almost by happenstance, by accident, rather than by design is happening. But the part that the new frontier economies governments have some control over is how they address the issue of presenting their situation when they do get the opportunity, such as the opportunity that can present itself at a forum like the Future Investment Initiative here in Riyadh. And I think that as much as we can easily be focused on there's that specific commodity that's of value or could be of value, and that is what we identify with that country X in that new frontier category. We're not putting enough thought and emphasis, as I say, on how they communicate that. And the two have to go together hand in hand. There has to be the salesmanship has to go along with the valuable product itself. And I think to this point, the Asian countries such as Vietnam and Cambodia are doing a better job than some of their African peers. And again, I think in Nigeria, I mean, again, I wouldn't categorize Nigeria as a new frontier economy anymore, but some do. And if you do, I think you have to recognize that Nigeria has done a much better job than most of its African peers in persuading the world, persuading investors that should be a target for foreign investment, and with quite a good track record recently, in particular. And whereas a country like Kenya hasn't done as well. And what we can see, even with recent sort of facts that are at hand, data at hand, is that countries that were both, you might say, pick country X and Y, even on the same continent, that were both new frontier economies. And now one of them is, most of us would classify that country as an emerging market. And is it because that country has that many more resources, or et cetera, et cetera? Not necessarily. It can be as simple, but as important as they've just simply done a better job of selling themselves. The same thing in Asia, right? So the devil is very much in the details here, and you can't characterize you can't. It's the risk of over characterizing, oversimplifying the groups, because it's what the individual countries do within each category that's going to make the difference for their future, not a broad brush stroke approach in terms of, well, they're all in that pot, they're all in that pot, we know what's going on, because often we don't. But it's up to those individual countries to do a better job of telling the rest of the world what exactly is going on in their country and in their economy.